Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the second lecture concerning systematics and the construction of evolutionary trees. We'll first look at principles of cladistics, which is the foundation of evolutionary analysis. From there, we'll actually take a look at how to create a character matrix, and we'll use that character matrix to finally create a cladogram. And we'll do all of this while looking at some of our marine mammal populations, such as the pinnipeds. Cladistics basically says this. If you take a group of organisms and they have similar character states, then they are evolutionarily related to each other. We call that principle a shared derived character state. That's kind of a funky term, so let's actually take a look at it in more detail. Shared means that individuals or organisms share a particular trait. Let's take a look at this character matrix here. We have a guppy, a turtle, and a leopard. And we have three characters that we're looking at. Hare, whether or not they have 4 walking legs, and whether or not they have a vertebral column. Based on the character matrix, you can see some of them are filled in with minuses, which means they don't have that particular character state, and some of them are filled in with pluses, which means they do. So when we take a look at which character states are shared, you can see that all of them share a vertebral column. And that's pretty obvious. A guppy, a turtle, and a leopard all share a vertebral column. However, only the turtle and the leopard share the 4 pairs of walking legs. So that's what we mean when we say shared. Now, probably a little bit more important is, what does derived mean? And that is explored here. The word derived basically says that we are going to assume it is derived from an ancestral state. An ancestral state is sometimes called a primitive state. So we have primitive and derived. In order to determine which character state is the primitive and which one is the derived state, you actually do have to have a preconceived notion about what primitive really is. So for example, among vertebrate evolution, we know that hair didn't come out with the vertebrates. It was derived at a later date. So that means that not having hair would be considered to be the primitive state, where hair would be the derived state. We actually have special terms for these ideas. A plesiomorph is going to be a primitive character state, and an apomorph is going to be a derived character state. So take a look at this character matrix and determine one plesiomorph and one apomorph. For the 4 pairs of walking legs, not having 4 pairs of walking legs would be considered the plesiomorph, or the primitive character state. Having 4 pairs of walking legs would be considered the apomorph, or the derived character state. Once we create a character matrix for a group of organisms that we're trying to create an evolutionary hypothesis for, we use that character matrix to build what is called a cladogram. And a cladogram basically tries to put together the organisms based on their evolutionary relatedness, using the assumption that if they have shared derived character states, they're related to each other. Let's create our very own character matrix for the pinnipeds. And the pinnipeds, you might recall, are going to be the seals and the sea lions. And from there, we'll actually create our very own cladogram. The first thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to jot down this character matrix. If you need to, go ahead and pause the video while you copy this character matrix down. We're going to go ahead and look at 3 different groups of pinnipeds. The true seals, which are called the phocids. We also have the sea lions and the fur seals. Those are going to be the otariids. And finally, we have the walruses. You might notice a 4th group in there, and those are the bears. The bears are not pinnipeds, but we always need some primitive organism or organismal group to base the rest of the character matrix off of. And we hope that whatever organism we select is going to show almost all plesiomorphs, or primitive characters. So we call that other reference group an outgroup. We don't really care about that, but we use it as a basis from which to look at apomorphs. So here we're going to use bears as our outgroup. They're not really marine mammals, well, they're not, except for polar bears, they're not marine mammals at all. But they provide a basis of plesiomorphs from which to reference against. Now let's take a look at who we're going to actually evaluate, and these are our pinnipeds. The pinnipeds are going to be the seals, the first seals, and of course the walruses. In order to evaluate them, you first have to know what the plesiomorphs are. For the bears, I've actually filled that in for you. We have a thin blubber layer. Bears do not have a thick blubber layer. It's quite thin. They do have what is called a lacrimal bone, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And of course, you might notice that they have a thick fur coat. Bears do have a thick fur coat. They do not have any tusks, and they do indeed have what's called an ear flap. Bears have ears. This would be an ear flap. All right, now let's take a look at some pictures of our pinnipeds and see if we can assess their character states. Here we have our three groups, the otariids, the phocids, and finally the walrus group. Let's take a look first at blubber layer. Blubber layer is going to be basically based on thickness. All mammals have a blubber layer, but they don't all have the same thickness. You might notice that the phocids and the walrus actually look pretty hefty, and so they've got a pretty thick blubber layer. In contrast, the sea lions and the fur seals are much more streamlined looking, and so they actually have a thin blubber layer. From there, let's actually go back to our character matrix and fill in those character states. So we fill in our character states for blubber layer, where the true seals and the walruses have a thick blubber layer. Meanwhile, the sea lions and the fur seals retain their thin blubber layer. And since I don't actually have a skeleton to show you, we're going to fill in the lacrimal bone as well. The lacrimal bone is actually going to be a small bone right here in the skull that contains the tear ducts. And you'll have to take my word for it. Bears have one, but none of the pinnipeds have one. All right, from there, let's actually look at the other characters. The other ones that we want to evaluate are going to be whether or not they have a thick fur coat, whether or not they have tusks, and whether or not they have ear flaps. So you can see from this picture here, the only ones to retain a thick fur coat are going to be our otariids, our fur seals, and our sea lion, whereas the true seals and the walrus seem to not have a very thick fur coat at all, if any. Meanwhile, of course, obviously, the only group to have tusks are going to be the walrus. And then take a good look at ears. You'll notice I actually have the ears circled, or the ear flaps circled, for the otariids. But when we take a good look at the true seals, they don't have any, nor do the walruses. So with that, we can go ahead and finish filling in our character matrix. By the time you're done, your character matrix should look like the one on screen. The next question to ask, once you've created a character matrix, is where are the plesiomorphs? We know that the plesiomorphs are going to be what the bear has. That's why we picked the bear as an outgroup. So where else do we see the plesiomorphs in this character matrix? And I've actually circled them for you. So we notice a heavy concentration of them are actually found with the otariids, which probably leads you to think, hey, maybe the otariids and the bears are kind of similar. And indeed, they sure seem like it. So with this in mind, let's actually go ahead and start constructing our cladogram. You're going to want to get out a sheet of paper and copy along as you see on the TV. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is actually take a look at your character matrix and try to identify one or more characters that all the pinnipeds share that is an apomorph. And there is one on this character matrix. It's actually going to be the lacrimal bone. You'll notice that all three pinnipeds have lost their lacrimal bone, and that is considered to be derived. The loss of the lacrimal bone is actually a derived state, and it's different than the bears, which have one. So from there, let's go ahead and get started. When we draw our cladogram, you're first going to draw a really large check mark, and then you always put the outgroup, which in this case is the bears, in the left upper corner. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to mark any character state that is derived or an apomorph. So here we're going to go ahead and make a little mark that says loss of lacrimal bone. And what that mark means is anything to the right of that mark is also going to share that particular state. So at this point, let's go ahead and go back to our pinniped character matrix. We've already dealt with the lacrimal bone, so we can go ahead and cross that off so we don't have to deal with it anymore. What we're going to do now is we're going to look and see, is there any other organism that now looks just like the bear? And indeed, we notice that the pinnipeds, that are the sea lions and fur seals, the otariids, have a very similar character matrix to the bears. They share the same thin blubber layer, they share a thick fur coat, they share no tusks, and they share an ear flap. So we can actually at this point go ahead and draw in the otariids on our cladogram. So in order to show the otariids branching off next off this evolutionary tree, you draw a big thick line up with the word otariid at the top. Now we've actually dealt with the otariids. We don't need to consider them anymore, and all that's left are the phocids and the walruses. So going back to our character matrix, let's go ahead and take a look at our revised list here. We have our phocids, which are our true seals, and our walruses. If you just look at these two, you'll notice they actually share quite a few apomorphs, such as a thickened blubber layer, a loss of a fur coat. They don't share the tusks, but they do also show the loss of an ear flap. So we can actually go ahead and mark those three apomorphs on our cladogram. So we have here the sparseness of the fur coat. We actually have loss of an ear flap and a thickened blubber layer. Now it doesn't matter which order you put those in. You're not trying to say that one adaptation came before another. You're simply saying that these three adaptations occurred, and then we have our next group. So who do we have at this point? Well, now we've accounted for the true seals, or the phocids. So we can go ahead and put the phocids right there. Now at this point, we really only have the walrus left. So we know where the walrus is going to go. The walrus is going to go at the very end of this cladogram. But we have one more character state that we still need to deal with, and that is the tusks. So the walrus have their own unique apomorph in tusks. So the last thing that we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and actually take a look at the tusks, go ahead and include them in the cladogram, and then finally we have our walrus. So this is our completed cladogram. Now let's actually take a moment and try to interpret what this is saying. Here's what we've said. We've said that the phocids and the walruses are probably more related to each other than either of them are to the otariids, based on these three character states that separate them. We also say that the walruses and the phocids are going to be farther away from the outgroup, which are the bears, than the otariids. Now, another interesting way to read this is basically assuming that any time you have a character state, a new apomorph, such as a sparse fur coat, anything to the right basically says that they share that character state. Now remember, cladistics is based on this principle. Organisms that have shared derived traits are going to be evolutionarily related to each other. Now that brings up a really interesting idea, because let's take the loss of the ear flap, for example, which is shown here. What we're really saying is that both the phocids and the walruses have lost their ear flap, but they didn't lose them independently. And that's the foundation of cladistics. We assume that because they both share that, they are related. In other words, at some point an ancestral species lost the ear flap, and then we had the evolution of the phocids and the evolution of the walruses. It's not that the phocids lost their ear flap over here and the walruses did over here. Now, is that a true assumption? It isn't always so, and that is one of the reasons why cladistics isn't always going to be the true hypothesis for our evolutionary tree. All right, with that, we'll continue on the concept of phylogeny in future lectures.